Hi there, I'm Stephanie Ruhle. It's Monday, March 9th, and we begin with breaking news. Stock futures are in free fall this morning, partly because of the coronavirus and partly because of a new global shock. Oil markets crashing all over the world after a dispute between Russia and Saudi Arabia led to the Saudis dramatically cutting oil prices. That's helping drag down the whole market. Dow futures pointing to a drop of more than 1,000 points when the bell rings in just about half an hour from now. This, of course, comes against the backdrop of more disturbing developments regarding the spread of coronavirus. Overseas, countries are taking dramatic action to stop the spread. A chunk of northern Italy now on lockdown for the next month. I am talking about 16 million people, a region the size of our West Coast. Saudi Arabia and Qatar cut off travel to multiple countries that have reported infections. Back here in the United States, much of the debate is focused on clear and transparent communication. On the day the president appointed Vice President Mike Pence to be in charge of this effort, he said we had 15 cases and the number would soon go to 0. So where are we now? The number of cases in the United States is now well over 500. 22 people have died. Cases have been confirmed in nearly 3 dozen states plus Washington, D.C. That number includes 21 people who've been diagnosed with the coronavirus aboard the Grand Princess cruise ship. That ship will dock in Oakland, California today. Then it is up to federal and state officials to process thousands of passengers on board. I want to bring in Erin McLaughlin. She's in Oakland. Hans Nichols is with the president in West Palm Beach, Florida. Erin, give us the latest with the cruise ship.
Hey, Stephanie. Well, the Grand Princess is expected to arrive here at the port of Oakland sometime today. Unclear exactly when. Authorities have described this operation as hugely complex, especially when you consider that cruise ships don't normally dock here at the port of Oakland. And so they're going to be looking at a number of factors, including tide. Once they've determined that the conditions are optimal, then they will give the ship the green light to make its way here. 2.5 hours out off the coast at this point once it docks. Then the passengers will be allowed off in groups, the first group being anyone who's symptomatic, anyone who's in urgent need of medical care will be allowed off first, followed by Californians. Over 960 Californians on board the Grand Princess. They will be taken to Travis Air Force Base, and then the rest of the passengers will be allowed to disembark, remaining behind over 1,000 crew members. They'll then take the Grand Princess out to sea. Worth keeping in mind that of the 21 people aboard the Grand Princess who tested positive for the coronavirus, 19 of them were crew members. So their fate will is still unknown. It's still uncertain, but they will be taking the ship back out to sea. Most of the passengers I've been talking to tell me that they just want the uncertainty to end. They want to know when they can go home.
Uncertainty, that has been the thing that has put so much pressure and panic on so many. Hans, we know that the president did not want that ship to dock. He said it himself. He didn't want his numbers to go up. Over the last few days, people in and outside of this White House have urged the president to get off this concern about how things appear and get real. What do we know about his plans to combat this threat going forward?
Well, the president has a public plan, and that's the rhetoric and the optics, which we've seen over the last 72 hours. Stephanie, what we've also seen over the last 72 hours is a widening of the gap between what the president is saying and what members of his task force are saying. And that is increasing concern. You heard Dr. Fauci on the Meet the Press saying that he was worried about this spreading at the community level. Now, you had a little bit of divergence within the task force on the optimism, pessimism spectrum. But from the president, you basically have a wash your hands strategy. And that's not talking politically about it, although it may. You heard from Stephanie Grisham this morning saying we're basically treating this like the flu. They want to make sure that there isn't overall panic. Now, there's a third camp in the White House, and that's on the political economic side. And they seem to be suggesting that this is all but contained. At the same time, they are working on policy proposals to lessen the economic impact. And they're all sort of things they can do. Tailored and targeted is a term we heard from Larry Kudlow. But they are working overtime to make sure that the stock market dip that you've been talking about all morning doesn't turn into a broader economic downturn. Stephanie?
All right, joining us now to dig deeper into this, two of the best reporters reporters on this very beat. Helen Bronswell writes about infectious diseases for STAT, a news site focused on health, and Reed Wilson, national correspondent for The Hill, author of Epidemic, Ebola, and the Global Scramble to Prevent the Next Killer Outbreak. Reed, the Surgeon General said we are moving from containment to mitigation. A, what does that mean? And B, is it true?
So a containment strategy is basically trying to stop the virus from spreading beyond where it is now. A mitigation strategy is more about broadening the outbreak, if you will, letting it happen over a longer period of time. And it's a recognition that containment doesn't work. It hasn't worked in this case. The goal here is to make sure that this outbreak happens over a broad period of time so that the U.S. healthcare system isn't overwhelmed with the number of patients. If a lot of people get this really quickly, the U.S. health system simply doesn't have the capacity to treat them, and that's when people start dying in broad numbers if they're not able to get into a hospital. If there are the same number of cases but over a much broader period of time, that gives healthcare workers and doctors the opportunity and the ability to treat them because the system won't be overwhelmed. So it's what health departments across the country have been doing over the last couple of weeks, trying to promote these social distancing strategies so that the virus, if it does spread, it spreads more slowly. It's really just a recognition that this virus is spreading in the United States, and it's not going to go away by some fanciful effort to contain it.
But shouldn't we have the ability, at the very least, to test? Helen, the Wall Street Journal has an article out today saying that Canada and Israel have tested 2,000 to 3,000 people. The UK has tested 20,000, and South Korea has tested 180,000 people. The CDC has run less than 500 tests. There's been conflicting numbers about how many Americans have been tested. So what in the world is going on?
Well, if I could, first of all, the CDC has tested more like 1,600 now, but that is still a very low number. That doesn't include, of course, the tests that are being run at the state and local level. As your listeners, I'm sure, would know, there was a problem with the test that was rolled out in early February. State and local labs had trouble using it. It took a long time to address, and it's cost the country an enormous amount of preparatory time. Effectively, people have been flying blind for the last month, not knowing where this virus is, but that problem seems to be working its way out. Many, or most even, state and local labs now can test, and so we're going to see numbers rise pretty substantially, I think, both in the numbers of tests conducted and numbers of cases as the testing comes online.
But why? Why, Helen, would we be scrambling? Why would we be caught flat-footed? We're the United States of America. Speed, agility, ingenuity, money, we have all these things.
You know, there are going to be books written about this, and I don't have all the answers right at the moment, but the test that the CDC designed appeared to have had a problem. One part of it was a three-part test. One part of it was to try to make sure that labs weren't picking up another coronavirus. As you may know, there are 4 coronaviruses that cause common colds. They spread every year, and they wanted to make sure that if somebody was testing positive, they weren't positive for one of those other very mild coronaviruses. For some reason or other, state and local labs couldn't get that part of the test to work properly, and that's what caused the problem. Other countries seem not to have had either such a complicated test or, you know, I don't know, it had something to do with the way it was designed.
Communication and transparency are paramount. Reed, I know cable viewers have certainly seen this over the weekend, but I want to share it again. Here's what the American people got from 2 of the top White House officials on Friday.
I will still argue to you that this is contained. But it can't be airtight.
It is being contained. And do you not think it's being contained?
From the people you speak to, is the message we are getting from the White House and healthcare experts an accurate depiction of the threat that we really face?
You know, I've been talking to a lot of the sources I talked to about the Ebola outbreak a few years ago, and the level of frustration that they have with what's coming out of the White House and the administration is tremendous. They're really frustrated that we're not hearing more from Dr. Anthony Fauci, whose level of trust across government is unmatched, and that we're hearing still these fanciful notions that something like this can be contained or is being contained. It's simply not, and the messages because of that have been been muddled, and local governments really don't have sort of the direction that they need to take some of the steps to mitigate this virus. In Seattle, at the heart of this epidemic, 30,000 people showed up yesterday for the opening soccer game. I mean, that's a decision that a lot of people made that they probably shouldn't have made. We're going to see some significant disruptions to our daily lives. I mean, they have shut down Mass in Italy, at the heart of Catholicism, for a month. If that's happening in Italy, something significant, we're going to have some serious disruptions here in our daily lives. And what the federal government can do now is to prepare Americans so that we're ready for it. You know, Americans aren't dumb. We know what to do in the case of a virus. Studies have shown, studies by the CDC have shown that Americans are willing to take significant and drastic steps in order to stop the spread of a virus, so long as we know what to do. And the administration is not giving us that guidance right now.
All right, Reed, Helen, thank you both so much. Now we've got to turn to markets where uncertainty over coronavirus has already caused a major roller coaster. Again, lack of information. But now there's another challenge. It's over the price war on oil, which is making a bad situation even worse. CNBC's Willem Marks joins me now. Willem, these things are actually connected, coronavirus and this oil price war. Help us understand it.
Well, essentially what we've seen, Steph, in countries like China is the demand for oil dramatically fall off over the last couple of months because factories have been closed, people have been staying at home. And so last week, when members of OPEC met in Vienna to try and decide on the possibility of extending artificial cuts to global supply, they couldn't find common ground. The Russians refused to play ball with the Saudis and other Gulf countries. And what that meant effectively is at the end of this month, the beginning of April, the Saudis have decided to slash their published oil prices and potentially will ramp up production. This is all about the laws of supply and demand. What that means, the price goes down. We've seen that over the last 12 or 14 hours since the market opened for this week, a huge fall in the price of oil. And that has a knock-on effect because a lot of these big companies, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, they rely on a high price of oil in order to make money. And if they don't have that, then people will sell off their shares. And that's being another major impact on stock markets around the world so far.
It is stunning if you think about it. In the last 2 weeks, the president and his advisors have gone on TV, downplayed the spread of the coronavirus because they wanted the markets to move higher. And what's the net result? Both may have suffered. Willem, thank you so much. We have more breaking news. 2 U.S. service members were killed on Sunday as part of a joint raid with Iraqi forces trying to eliminate an ISIS stronghold in north-central Iraq. The names of the service members are being withheld until the families are notified. Tomorrow, another 352 delegates are up for grabs as voters in 6 states head to the polls. A lot of focus on Michigan, Washington, and Mississippi, 3 states that could give major insight into how the road to the nomination could play out. At this point, the race and the polls keep changing by the day. This morning, Senator Cory Booker endorsed former Vice President Biden, tweeting that he will restore honor to the Oval Office. This comes after both frontrunners received major endorsements over the weekend. Former 2020 contender and California Senator Kamala Harris on International Women's Day throwing her support behind former VP Biden as civil rights leader Jesse Jackson endorsed Senator Bernie Sanders. Joining me now to discuss, Lily Adams, former communications director for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign, Michael Steele, former senior advisor to Jeb Bush and former spokesperson for House Speaker John Boehner, and Detroit native Ron Fournier, veteran journalist who has covered presidential politics for decades. And he's also a Michigan native. Lily, to you first. Why did Senator Harris come out with an endorsement for the former VP after the California primary? That's where she's got a lot of sway.
Well, look, I think, one, she wanted to make clear that she believes that Joe Biden is the best candidate to not just take on Donald Trump, but also to restore this country after we get rid of him in November. But, two, I think she was very cognizant that there were a historic number of women in the race, and I think felt strongly that it was important to allow those women to see their candidacies through before she threw her support behind anybody. And obviously we saw after Senator Warren got out of the race that she made it clear that Joe Biden was the best candidate to lead Democrats.
Ron, take us inside Michigan. The latest poll from the Detroit Free Press that's out today has Biden with a 24-point lead in Michigan. But back in 2016, the very same poll showed Hillary Clinton with a 25-point lead, and she lost. So what are you hearing?
Yeah, you can't trust polls in Michigan, but I do hear that Biden is much better positioned now than Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago. You have the same coalition that 2 years ago lifted Governor Whitmer to election and led Democrats across the country to huge gains in the House and the Senate. That is your suburban women and African Americans. That's the coalition that lifted Biden on Super Tuesday. That's the coalition that's going to win here in Michigan. And Biden is probably in best position to win. He's supported Michigan on the bailout. He has shown up and spent time in Michigan, unlike Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. And Bernie Sanders, I think, has an issue with single payer. This is a state where families fought for employer-backed health care, pretty good health care coverage in the state. And the idea of taking it away probably doesn't settle very good with a lot of union voters.
Michael, another very interesting state is Washington. In 2016, Senator Sanders won by 46 points. But they have switched from a caucus to a primary, and it's a vote-by-mail state. What are you watching?
Well, I think it's really interesting. As NBC's own Mark Murray pointed out to me last week, Bernie Sanders won the caucuses in 2016, but they had a non-binding primary a few weeks later, which Secretary Clinton won huge. So I think it's a very good chance that the former vice president could actually surprise Bernie Sanders and win in the state of Washington.
Ron, let's talk moderates for a moment and moderate consolidation. There's a new national poll out today that has former VP Biden with a double-digit lead over Senator Sanders, 52% to 36%. Was that double-digit lead? Can you attribute that to the consolidation that moderates were hoping for?
Yeah, I also contribute to the fact that the Democratic Party isn't as left-leaning as you'd think so if you spent all your time on Twitter. Especially, look, the African-American voters are very pragmatic voters. They're not as liberal as a lot of, frankly, white liberal voters who live in Brooklyn and in California. So it's not surprising at all that a party right now whose #1 issue is Donald Trump is beating the guy in the White House. You have now voters coalescing around who they think, they might be wrong, but who they think is most likely to beat Donald Trump. And right now, the consensus seems to be that that's Joe Biden.
Lily, what are you looking out for tomorrow?
I think one thing is, there'll be a lot of focus on Michigan tomorrow, rightfully so. Obviously, it's why you've got Ron here and other experts. But don't sleep on Mississippi, where I think Joe Biden has a huge opportunity to possibly shut out Bernie Sanders in terms of getting delegates in that state, but certainly to run up the score there, which will make it extremely difficult for the rest of the month for Bernie Sanders to be able to catch up if Joe Biden really presses his advantage.
Michael, last word to you.
Well, I think that the president was really hoping to run against Bernie Sanders, and that is increasingly unlikely these days, particularly if we see the results that we expect tomorrow.
All right. Thank you all so much. It is going to be a very big day. But before we get to that, I want to bring in Charlie Cook, editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report. He's also an NBC News political analyst. Charlie, the top of the Cook Report has this headline: Biden's edge for the nomination is even larger than it appears. Explain.
Yes, that when you sort of look at the path, I mean, we were really at a point going into Super Tuesday where Bernie Sanders could have built a insurmountable lead. But once you saw that consolidation and then you look at the primaries that are coming up, I think it's looking very, very strong for Joe Biden. I think, the biggest thing was you had to have that consolidation that you were talking about. As long as the conventional sort of establishment mainstream Democratic vote was split 4 ways, and on the left-hand side, Warren was fading, so Bernie Sanders had a straight shot at the nomination then. Now he doesn't. Now I think you're going to see the bigger part of the party coalesce, and the events coming up are ones that I think are tilted towards Biden.
Do you see a possible path for Senator Sanders?
Oh, possible. Heck, we're talking human nature and politics. Of course, there's a path, but I think it's looking much better for Joe Biden. And the fact that you're starting to see these national polls, like the CNN poll that came out today, that it's looking. I think people are feeling, Democrats are feeling more comfortable with this is the matchup they want, that I think they're convinced that Biden would do a lot better. The matchup with President Trump, Biden does a tiny bit better, but when you look at the damage, the potential out there for Republicans to attack Sanders on a number of things, his 8-point lead over President Trump looks a little softer, I think, than Biden's 9-point lead.
Then especially in a state like Michigan, Michigan. What are you focused on tomorrow, not just for the Democratic nomination, but for November?
Well, you know, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, you know, that was the whole presidency last time. I think this time we're going to have to be also keeping a very close eye on Arizona and North Carolina, and of course there's Florida. But to me, those are the 6 states that really matter. Those are the 6 states that we're now calling toss-up in our new ratings that are coming out now. That's where it's going to be. But Michigan, you know, you could argue whether Wisconsin or Michigan is a tipping point state, but they're both going to be extremely, extremely important. And that's where this Medicare for All doesn't work well for Sanders. These union members, these UAW members, they negotiated real hard to get really generous health care benefits, and they're not going to give those away easily.
Well, let's talk down ballot for a moment. We just learned that Governor Steve Bullock is now running for Senate in Montana. How does that impact, does it impact the Democrats' chance of winning back the Senate?
It does, because Democrats had, you could see how Democrats could get, they needed 3 seats net if they win the White House, 4 seats if they don't. But Doug Jones in Alabama, a Democrat in Alabama, is pretty likely to lose. So effectively, Democrats need 4. You could get Democrats up to 48, 49 seats pretty easily. Arizona against McSally, Colorado against Cory Gardner, Maine, Susan Collins. All of those are races where Democrats are looking very, very strong, but they needed 1 more. And whether it was Tom Tillis in North Carolina or one of the 2 Georgia seats, or with Bullock coming online in Montana, possibly Kansas if Pompeo doesn't come back, which I still think there's a chance he will. You know, there are multiple paths to a majority for Democrats now, so they don't have to pull necessarily an inside straight. Right now, I'd still say Republicans are narrow favorites to hold on to the Senate, but you see multiple paths for Democrats to get there.
Charlie, thank you so much for joining us. Every time we see you, you make us a little bit better and a little bit smarter. We appreciate it. Breaking news, markets just opened and down 1,700. Joining me now to discuss, Andrew Ross Sorkin, co-author of CNBC's Squawk Box, New York Times columnist and author of Too Big to Fail, and Gary Cohn is here, former director of the National Economic Council and chief economic advisor to President Donald Trump during the first 2 years of his presidency, and former president of Goldman Sachs. Welcome to you both. Andrew, we got to start with you. Dealbook headline this morning, markets are getting punched in the face. Explain what's going on.
We're looking at a very tough day in the markets, and frankly, I think there's a real question now over how much the coronavirus spills into the real economy. We saw it over the weekend. Crude prices have now dropped 21%, which means effectively that there are going to be some energy companies in the United States and elsewhere that effectively could go out of business. So we're talking about a real loss of jobs, and I think some real questions. What took place in Italy over the weekend, I think the market and investors are trying to extrapolate out to try to understand, is that coming here? What does that look like? Our 545 cases that have been identified, is that number real, and how much larger is that number? So I think all of this is now getting into the marketplace. There are questions about what are called circuit breakers in the stock market today. At 7%, if there's a 7% decline, there's a 15-minute timeout. There's another timeout at 13% and another timeout at 20%. But this is the first time people are talking about circuit breakers. So we're into a new period here where investors are trying to understand what could happen. Morgan Stanley put out a note this morning saying that the stock market could drop another 10%. Their estimates it could drop further. And I think we're now into a period of demonstrable fear, dare I say. To be responsible about it, I don't want to suggest that it is all doom and gloom, but clearly it is going to get worse before it gets better.
Gary, what do you have to say about all this?
Well, look, I agree with what a lot of Andrew just said. But I think what we have to ask ourselves is, why are we here and how do we get here? And think of where we were 3 or 4 short weeks ago. We were at all-time record highs. We had employment numbers Friday that reflected where we were last month. And where we were last month has nothing to do with where we are today. And I think people have to understand that.
But 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were not addressing a pending public health crisis.
Stephanie, I completely agree with that. I said where we are today. So we are now dealing with an economy where there's been massive demand destruction in the oil market. And we saw the demand destruction in the oil market. We saw OPEC try to deal with the demand destruction, how they were going to deal with each other. Would they all cut back on production? There was no agreement reached in cutting back on production. And so the Saudis said, look, if we're not going to agree on all curtailing production, we'll flood the market and we'll show you. We'll take some of you producers that are high-cost producers, and we'll force you to sell every drop of oil you produce at a loss, and we'll see how long you can do that. So we're really having somewhat irrational behavior as people try and protect their own economies right now in this area. In the equity markets, we're now seeing people trying to price in behavior based on the virus. And they're trying to price in, what is a company going to earn next month or next quarter or the quarter after? How long is this going to be, is this economy going to be like this? Are people going to go out and spend again? Can people go out and spend again? People that want to work, can they work? Can they actually bring home a paycheck?
Okay.
And if they can't bring home a paycheck, it is going to have a direct impact on the economy.
Then let's talk about the policies that are being put in place. Last week when the Fed cut rates, an emergency rate cut, people aren't going to go out and starting a business or buy a home and spend when all the health professionals and corporate leaders are telling us to hunker down and stay home.
Look, this is not a liquidity crisis. This is not an 08 crisis. We have plenty of liquidity in the crisis.
What does that mean?
There is no lack of liquidity in the financial system. Banks are awash with cash. Look, there's people just trying to invest cash overnight, every night. You know, one thing Andrew didn't mention is we've got a 10-year interest rate in the United States today below 50 basis points. We're around 44, 45 basis points in the United States. That's all-time historic lows. We're not there because people want it there. We're there because everyone wants to invest their money in safety and soundness, meaning they're willing to take a much lower rate of return on their money to make sure they get it back. So people are buying U.S. Treasuries at less than 0.5% return because that's where they feel safety and soundness is. So the system that we deal with, the economic system, the market system, is flooded with cash right now. People probably have more cash than they've had in a long period of time because they're consuming less. People are choosing not to travel. You see it in the airport. People are choosing not to go out to dinner. People are choosing not to ride taxis, not to ride Ubers, not to go out and do the things that they're normally doing in the economy. So when the Fed cuts interest rates, it's not going to spur economic growth. It's going to make money cheaper. Money was already cheap and available.
Okay.
The market had priced it for them.
Then, Andrew, what is this about? Is this about fear and transparency? CNBC reporting right now that trading is halting. If 2 weeks ago the president would have said, let's put a pause on the idea of economic growth and let's address this public health crisis, would we be in a different situation? Because the president, Larry Kudlow, and other members of this administration have been talking up the markets and talking down the virus, and now what are we doing? Hurting both.
Well, look, first of all, the market is now halted. This is exactly what we just talked about literally minutes ago about the idea of a circuit breaker. It's now happened at that 7% level. As to what the president could have done or did do, I think this is much more about testing and whether the CDC could have gotten ahead of this. Clearly, we're behind it, and I think part of the fear factor here for investors is trying to understand the numbers that we do have and how accurate or inaccurate they really are. That's a huge part of this, that ultimately the investment community does not believe those numbers and does not believe, even if you do believe those numbers, that we're going to be able to get ahead of it. You know, thus far, all of the identified cases are relatively in places where the type of workers are service workers. People can do their job over Gmail and Zoom. They can work from home if ultimately that turns out to be what it is. We have not heard about cases, meaningful cases in places like Detroit or places where we actually manufacture things in real ways. And that's if we have that across the country, it becomes very difficult very, very quickly. I don't, again, want to be alarmist about this, but I think part of the issue that investors are trying to understand is just how long this could go on for and what real impact it's going to have, both on people's ability to work, which is a supply story, and people's demand story, which is, are they going to go to the shopping mall? People are clearly going to supermarkets to try to get everything off the shelf, but are they going to do anything else? Are they going to get on airplanes? I had a conversation with my great-grandmother last night about getting on an airplane. people are not going to be doing that and shouldn't be doing that. And I think those are the questions. And whether we're ultimately going to, I'd be very curious to hear from Gary, whether we're going to ultimately start talking about bailouts. Are we going to be talking about bailing out the energy industry, the airline industry?
What do you think, Gary?
Look, we're at a point now where we're going to have to talk about how do we sustain an airline industry here in the United States? If consumers stop flying, which they are, you know, Andrew just said his grandmother shouldn't get on an airplane. I happened to fly yesterday, and my daughter flew to Florida. She said, ironically, the plane was quite empty. We're going to need to make sure that we protect our airline industry. Ultimately, we're going to come out of this. And I think that's one of the things I'm trying to say is we don't know how long this is going to last. The only thing I know for sure is we will look back on this at some day in the future and say what we could have and should have done. We're going to have to protect the airline industry. We're going to have to protect workers that can't go to work because A, their job doesn't exist, or B, they may be stuck home taking care of someone who's sick, and they don't have a salaried employee, or they don't have a company that's big enough or strong enough to allow them to receive a paycheck. And so if you're a gig worker in the gig economy today, or you're a service worker out there working for yourself,
8 million people total.
You don't have someone sending you a paycheck. So if you're an Uber driver out there today, you know, anywhere in the world, trying to get a fare and your phone doesn't light up with a fare, you can't create income for yourself. Those are the people we have to take care of. If you work for a large company, you're going to stay on the payroll and you're going to get paid.
Then what do you recommend we do? Andrew Yang has said, let's go universal basic income. Jason Furman wrote on Friday, write a $1,000 check to every American. What do you think we should do?
Well, look, I think that's going too far to the extreme. I think we could be more subtle about that because there are a lot of people that will work and there are a lot of people that will stay on the payroll. So number one, we happen to be very lucky that we're in 2019 tax season. So number one is the Treasury IRS has to get tax refunds out immediately. So we've got to really speed up the tax refund process for 2019 taxes.
That could get delayed. That could get delayed in Washington.
We cannot let that get delayed. So people that get the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, or Child Care Credit, those are many of the people we're talking about. They need to get those refunds back immediately. Number two, what I would do is I would allow people to borrow against 2020 Earned Income Tax Credits and Child Care Credits. I would allow them to get a basically low interest or zero interest loan against next year's government credit they're going to get. It doesn't cost anything. We've got a 10-year rate now below 50 basis points. Financing hardworking Americans and being compassionate on them, it really has no cost. The cost of money today is almost non-existent.
Andrew, you wrote the book Too Big to Fail. In many of those situations, Gary, you were in the room. When it came to the financial crisis, Hank Paulson and leaders of the financial industry, Andrew, were in the same room saying, how do we solve for this? Right now, when you look at business leaders and our leaders in government, is there any level of trust or communication? Because if you look at the response between the two, they couldn't be more opposite.
I think we're not there yet, and I think we're not there yet for a couple of reasons. One is I think it's not just about getting out your financial bazooka and throwing money at the situation, though I think that's ultimately going to be needed and likely to help. The question is when you do that, and based on what information. I think part of the problem is we don't have all of the information that we need. We don't have all of the testing. We clearly don't have a vaccine. We don't even have a timeline for a vaccine. And I think those two component pieces, the actual data and the vaccine, or at least a timeline for the vaccine, are going to be hugely important. Then I think we're going to get into this bailout conversation and what that looks like. And I also think in this political climate, we're going to get into a very interesting conversation, not just about how we deal with employees and whether there's unemployment insurance and the like, but if we do get into bailing out an airline, for example, are we going to be having a conversation about corporate socialism? Are we going to have a conversation about what we're going to get back from those airlines, given how much anger there was about what was given to banks and what was given to the I mean, all of this is going to become a very interesting conversation, unfortunately, and I imagine it's going to happen soon, but I think it's a little too soon yet before we get there.
But, Gary, and I know we have to go, wouldn't you think public outrage would be different this time? In the financial crisis, the public was furious with banks or the auto industry because it was human-made. In this case, doesn't this get looked at like a natural disaster? Nobody's blaming the airline industry or the cruise industry.
I do hope that people look at this a little bit differently. But again, it's hard to predict people's behavior and how they're going to look on this with the whole socialism that we've looked at and the way that people think about corporate America today. They think differently than they did even 10 years ago, and they definitely think differently than they did during the financial crisis. I do believe that we are going to need the government to step in and help certain industries, and there's certain part of this country that doesn't believe that the government should come in and help certain industries, and the industries should stand on their own 2 feet. But look, we are not having totally rational consumer behavior right now.
Well, we're not getting honest information, Garrett, or enough information.
I don't know if we're getting honest or enough. I don't know who knows what.
Hold on a second. I know we're out of time, but can you actually say to me, you don't know if we're getting honest information? 2 weeks ago, the president said, the number is 15, it's going to 0. The number's over 500. So you can't say to me, you don't know if we're getting honest information, because we're not.
Well, I'm not here to argue the numbers. Look, I do agree with the experts on this. So when Scott Gottlieb comes on or Tom Bossert says certain things, I know they've spent a lot of time studying this, so I respect their opinion.
We're going to leave it there then. Gary Cohn, thank you. Andrew Ross Sorkin, we're going to check in again when the market is resumed. We've got to get back to the markets. Trading is resuming just after a mandatory 15-minute break when the markets dropped 7%. Andrew Ross Sorkin back with me. Andrew, it seemed like Gary was saying, don't you think the market looks cheap here? Given that the circuit breaker was enacted, I'd go with no.
I'd go with no for now. And look,
no for now,
I don't want to be alarmist because we have viewers out there that are going to say sell everything, and that may not be the right answer here at all. The markets have now tumbled from the peak, something on the order of about 15% at the moment. The question is how much farther that could go. Again, this really is based, people talk about the markets being disconnected from the real economy. This is now a real economy story. So are people really going to go to stores? How much of our world, our day-to-day life is going to change? We clearly see it in travel already, but how much farther does it go? And that's what I think is so hard for investors to try to, quote-unquote, math out. And the markets, of course, are predicting what's going to happen. It's not necessarily what is happening right this moment, and that's what makes this so tough. So we do have an issue. The markets are about to be back open if they're not already. I should tell you, just so you can do the math at home if you are investing today, down 7%. The next circuit breaker is at 13%, and the circuit breaker after that is at 20%. If the market were to fall 20% in one day, at any point during the day, the market would effectively close. It wouldn't just be a pause, if you will. They would stop for the day. The idea is to give people a bit of breathing room, some time to think. Yes.
I just want you to delineate for us, because people keep saying this is just fear breeding upon fear. Isn't this a reminder that the U.S. economy is service-based, unlike manufacturing-based in China, where they could say, you know what, let's all go back to work. Let's start manufacturing. That's how we make our money. Being a service-based economy, it doesn't mean we're going to just turn it around overnight. We're changing our behavior, possibly medium to long term, because of Corona.
Well, look, you have some companies, California-based companies, specifically the big tech companies like Salesforce, which have effectively said work from home for now. But those companies can afford to pay their people, and they can continue to work. I think the more complicated part, and we haven't gotten there yet, is what actually Gary was talking about, which is this gig economy, the Uber driver, everybody who's freelance, they're self-employed. And when those opportunities dry up, if they do, that's a demonstrable problem for the overall economy and for those individuals quite specifically. And so I think those are the things we're grappling with right now. And unfortunately, again, and you said it best, we don't know whether the numbers we even have in the United States as of today are real, let alone could it be a multiple more of them, and how fast this metastasizes, if you will, to use a medical term, on an issue that is now not only human, but turning economic.
Transparency is paramount. Andrew, thank you. Joining us now, Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo. Her state has 3 cases of coronavirus. Governor, weigh in.
Good morning. Good morning. Look, it's real, and as someone who is focused on this, I would say, we have to protect people. We have to be incredibly focused on containment, which is what I am focused on right now. But we shouldn't be panicking. I mean, the risk to the average Rhode Islander at this point is still low, very low. And so what it means is those of us who are on the front lines and those in Washington, we have to stay level-headed, but we have to take action. You know, as I'm listening here to what's happening in the stock market, we need to act. That means later today I'll be announcing emergency regulations to make sure that service workers and all workers can access paid sick leave, temporary disability insurance, unemployment insurance, and the federal government needs to do the same thing. We do have arrows in our quiver to blunt the economic impact here, and it's time to take action.
Governor, you said the coronavirus numbers are changing constantly. In your state, you've also said that we need to have test centers in not traditional hospital settings. Explain.
So what we're urging people now is if you feel sick or if you've been exposed to somebody with corona, we do not want you to go into the doctor's office or the emergency room. What we want you to do is pick up the phone. And so we have set up a hotline, which is staffed 24/7 by medical professionals. We want you to pick up the phone, and then you will be triaged into a safe place where you could be tested. And so we have set up throughout our state a number of facilities. I'm using the National Guard here to set up facilities, which are in many cases tents. You can drive in with your car, you can be tested, and then drive out and stay in your car until you have the results. Because what we're trying to do is keep our frontline medical professionals safe. And what I'm most worried about, of course, is having dozens or hundreds of healthcare workers in quarantine. So we're asking folks pick up the phone so that we can keep our frontline healthcare workers safe and healthy.
How do you balance that? The paramount concern of being safe. What if those precautions tip us into more unsafe situations? I want to talk about closing schools. Closing schools isn't just like a snow day. There are thousands of kids who are in school from 7 to 5, reliant on school to get the one healthy meal they can a day. If schools are suddenly closing, how do you take care of all of those kids?
Yes. So I do want to emphasize, at least here in Rhode Island, we have been preparing for this for weeks or a month. We have plans in place, assuming a school is closed. Many schools are closed already in Rhode Island. I have hundreds of people in quarantine now. We have 3 tested positive. We've tested dozens more over the weekend. We have had to close a school. Just over the weekend, I closed a daycare center. So what it means is constant collaboration, constant communication, and drawing on resources that are necessary. I also want to say the federal government needs to step up. You talk about closing a child care center, as I just did over the weekend. That means many parents are in quarantine now for 2 weeks, for 14 days. That means they ought to be able to collect unemployment, sick leave. At a bare minimum, we need federal paid sick leave. 3 years ago in Rhode Island, I pushed through 5 days of sick leave for every Rhode Islander. That has to happen federally.
Do you have all the test kits you need? President Trump said everybody can have them.
At this point, we do. At this point, I'm much more focused on getting more personal protective equipment. We need, the president and the vice president and federal delegations have to get the manufacture of PPE increased so every healthcare worker can be protected.
Governor, thank you for joining me. I appreciate your time this morning. We'll be right back with more. That wraps up this hour. I'm Stephanie Ruhle. Coming up right now, more news with Casey Hunt. Hey, Casey.